Somewhere on the western edge of Singapore, a port is running right now. Ships are arriving, containers are being unloaded, cargo is being sorted, stacked, and staged for departure. And across an area roughly the size of 3,300 football fields, almost none of it is being done by human hands. No dock workers shouting coordinates, no diesel-powered trucks idling between the cranes. Just a fleet of electric vehicles moving silently in the dark, guided by AI, directed by algorithms, and coordinated from a command center where a small team watches the whole operation on screens the size of walls. This is Tuas Port, Singapore's $20 billion bet on the future of global trade. When it's complete sometime in the 2040s, it will be the largest container port on the planet, handling 65 million containers every single year. That's more than the entire port of Shanghai handles today. But here's what makes Tuas genuinely different from every other megaport being built right now. It isn't being built to handle more ships. It's being built to make Singapore impossible to replace. And the story of why Singapore needs to do that, and what it means for trade, for workers, and for every country watching this build, is far more complicated than the technology itself. A country with no margin for error. To understand Tuas, you need to understand Singapore's fundamental problem. Singapore is a city-state the size of a small island with no agricultural land, no natural resources, and no industrial hinterland. It produces almost nothing that the world needs in raw form. It has no oil, no ore, no farmland. What it has is location positioned at the mouth of the Strait of Malacca, the narrow waterway that funnels roughly 40% of global trade between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. For decades, that location was enough. Ships traveling between Asia and Europe, between Asia and the Middle East, between China and everywhere else, they all passed through or near Singapore. The port became the intermediary for the world's most important trade lane, and Singapore built an entire economy around being the place where cargo changed hands. In 2024, Singapore handled 41 million TEUs, 20-foot equivalent container units across its terminals. That made it the second busiest container port in the world, behind Shanghai. Its network connects to more than 600 ports globally. It is the world's largest bunkering hub where ships refuel. The maritime industry accounts for roughly 7% of Singapore's entire GDP. But here's the vulnerability that keeps Singapore's planners awake. Everything Singapore earns from shipping is a fee. It doesn't grow the goods. It doesn't manufacture them. It moves them. And if the world finds another way to move them, or another place to move them through Singapore's economic model collapses, that is not a hypothetical. It is the exact threat that Tuas was designed to answer. What Tuas actually is. Tuas isn't just a port expansion. It's a complete consolidation. Singapore currently operates 4 separate container terminals: Tanjong, Pagar, Keppel, Brani, and Pasir Panjang, spread across different parts of the island. Ships calling at multiple terminals have to sail between them. Trucks hauling containers between terminals burn fuel and time. The fragmentation creates friction, and in global shipping, friction costs money. Tuas replaces all of them, everything in one location. One connected facility. One operating system. When complete, Tuas will have 66 berths stretching along 26 kilometers of quay, capable of accommodating the largest container ships afloat. Vessels over 400 meters long, carrying 20,000 or more containers per voyage in a single location. The automation at Tuas is what separates it from any port built before. More than 200 electric automated guided vehicles, AGVs, move containers across the terminal around the clock. Each vehicle can carry 2 0-foot containers simultaneously, traveling at speeds of nearly 16 miles per hour. They charge in 20 minutes and run for 6 hours. They navigate using RFID positioning. They communicate via a private 5G network. And when the network stutters, they don't stop. They're designed to continue operating safely, even under partial communication failure. The cranes that lift containers off ships are operated remotely from a command center. Operators sit at workstations, watching high-definition camera feeds and digital readouts, moving containers they'll never physically touch. The entire port, every vehicle, every crane, every stack exists simultaneously as a digital twin on a set of screens, a real-time mirror of the physical facility that planners can use to model congestion, optimize flows, and prevent problems before they happen. The efficiency gains are real. TUAS is designed to improve berth productivity by up to 30% over conventional ports. Ships spend less time waiting. Cargo moves faster. The emissions from port equipment drop by roughly 50% compared to diesel-powered alternatives because the AGVs and cranes run on electricity. But automation isn't the interesting part of this story. What it enables is the strategic logic. TUAS gives Singapore something it currently doesn't have: the ability to absorb the world's largest ships without asking them to slow down or wait. This matters more now than at any point in the last 2 decades. The global shipping industry has spent the last 15 years building bigger and bigger vessels. The economics are simple. Larger ships carry more containers, which reduces the cost per container. Today's biggest ships carry 24,000 TEUs. The ships being ordered now are even larger. And these vessels can only call at ports deep enough and large enough to receive them. Singapore's existing terminals are approaching their design capacity. In 2024 and into 2025, Singapore's ports experienced serious congestion at peak. More than 450,000 TEUs were waiting to dock, with vessels sitting at anchor for up to a week. Some shipping lines skipped Singapore entirely and diverted cargo to competitors. Others began testing Indian ports as transshipment alternatives for the first time. TUAS solves the capacity problem. But it also does something subtler. It raises the cost of leaving. When a shipping line commits to Singapore as a hub building schedules, contracts, and supply chain flows around TUAS, the switching cost becomes enormous. Rerouting away from a port of this scale requires negotiating new berthing windows, restructuring feeder networks, and renegotiating with customers whose cargo arrives via Singapore's connections to 600 other ports. The more integrated TUAS becomes with global shipping, the more expensive it becomes for anyone to choose a different hub. That's not just efficiency, that's lock-in. And lock-in is worth $20 billion. WHO loses. Here's where the story branches. TUAS doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's being built in a region where every neighboring country is watching closely and responding. Malaysia's Port Klang, just an hour's sail from Singapore, has announced plans to double its capacity to 27 million TEUs. Tanjung Pelepas, Malaysia's dedicated transshipment terminal, has been chipping away at Singapore's market share for years. In 2022, Maersk, one of the world's largest shipping lines, reallocated some transshipment volumes to Tanjung Pelepas, citing lower costs. Vietnam's Kai Mep Thi Vai complex has been positioning itself to receive mega-vessels and bypass Singapore for direct Asia-Europe routes. Indonesia is upgrading its port facilities. Thailand is revisiting an old and explosive idea, a land bridge across the Kra Isthmus that would allow ships to bypass the Strait of Malacca entirely, routing cargo overland instead of through Singapore's waters. If the Kra land bridge actually gets built, and Thailand has announced construction plans targeting 2026 with partial operations by 2030, analysts estimate it could divert up to 30% of Singapore's transshipment traffic. That's not a rounding error. That's an existential threat. And then there's the China dimension. Chinese ports have automated 52 container and dry bulk terminals as of 2025. Container volume at Chinese ports reached 300 million TEUs in 2024, 7 times Singapore's total. China's state-owned shipping companies, which control enormous portions of global container capacity, have political incentives to favor routes through Chinese ports, or ports that Beijing has invested in across the Belt and Road network. As Chinese ports become more efficient and Chinese shipping lines become more dominant, The argument for routing cargo through Singapore rather than directly weakens. Singapore has no domestic cargo base to fall back on. If transshipment traffic declines, there's no local manufacturing or consumption to compensate. The port either attracts global cargo or it doesn't. There is no middle option. The labor question no one wants to answer. But there's another story hiding inside Tuas that gets almost no attention in the coverage of the port. Singapore is building the future that American dock workers just went on strike to prevent. In late 2024, the International Longshoremen's Association, the union representing 45,000 dock workers at East and Gulf Coast ports across the United States, walked off the job for the first time since 1977. Among their core demands was not just higher wages, but a total ban on port automation. Not a slowdown, not a negotiated transition. A complete ban on automated cranes, automated gates, and automated container-moving vehicles. The union's argument was direct. Automation destroys jobs. A dock worker at a major U.S. port earns between $80,000 and over $100,000 a year. Automation replaces those workers, not immediately, but systematically. The ILA saw what happened at the few U.S. terminals that went fully automated and watched union jobs evaporate. They weren't wrong about the mechanism. They were right that automation reduces headcount. At Tuas, Singapore operates a port handling millions of containers with approximately 500 workers, a tiny fraction of what a conventional port of this scale would employ. The tension cuts in two directions simultaneously. Countries that choose not to automate keep their port jobs, but they also keep their inefficiencies, their congestion, their inability to handle the largest vessels, and their higher operating costs. Over time, cargo migrates to ports that can handle it faster and cheaper. Countries that automate become competitive. They attract the largest ships. They lower costs for global shippers. They keep trade flowing through their infrastructure. But the workers who used to load and unload those ships are no longer needed. There is no clean answer to this. It is the central dilemma of every port operator in the world right now. And Tuas sits at one extreme of the answer. What, Tuas, actually changes for trade? Here is what changes when the world's largest automated port reaches full capacity. First, shipping costs fall specifically for the companies and countries whose cargo flows through Singapore. Lower costs at the terminal pass through to lower freight rates, which pass through to lower prices for manufactured goods. Singapore isn't a manufacturer, but the countries whose goods move through Singapore, from Malaysia's electronics exports to India's pharmaceuticals to Germany's machinery sold into Asia, all see their logistics economics improve. Second, the bar for competing with Singapore rises permanently. Any port that wants to compete for the same cargo now has to match not just Singapore's geographic position, but its efficiency, its reliability, and its connectivity. Port Klang and Tanjung Pelepas can offer lower costs. They cannot easily replicate the network of 600 port connections, the depth of shipping alliance commitments, or the scale of a 6.5 million TEU facility. Third, and most importantly, Tuas changes the conversation about what a port is. For most of history, a port was a place where ships arrived and workers transferred cargo. The bottleneck was always human: how many workers, how quickly they could move, how many hours they could work before fatigue set in. Weather slowed them down. Disputes shut them down. Night reduced visibility. Illness reduced headcount. Tuas eliminates most of those constraints. It runs at 3 in the morning the same way it runs at noon. It doesn't call in sick. It doesn't go on strike. And as the AI systems running it learn from millions of container movements, they get better over time in ways that a human workforce simply cannot. That is a different kind of competitive advantage. It isn't a bigger crane or a deeper channel. It's a system that compounds the risks Singapore is taking. None of this means Tuas succeeds automatically. The 4-phase build stretching to the 2040s is a very long horizon. A lot can happen. Trade patterns shift. Geopolitical tensions fragment shipping routes into competing blocks. The tariff wars, reshaping global trade in 2025, are already causing companies to restructure supply chains in ways that bypass traditional intermediaries entirely. Singapore's model depends on being neutral, on being the place that everyone trusts, because it doesn't favor anyone. That neutrality has held for decades. But as global trade polarizes between US-aligned and China-aligned networks, the pressure on neutral hubs increases. Shipping companies may be compelled to choose lanes that align with their government's political preferences rather than the most efficient route. And the $20 billion investment itself carries a simple risk. What if trade volumes don't grow the way the models project? What if the big ships don't come in the numbers anticipated? Infrastructure that earns its return only at scale can be crippling if the scale doesn't materialize on schedule. Singapore is also betting that the technology works as promised, at the scale promised. TUIS Phase 1 has been operating since September 2022, and the early results are encouraging. But coordinating 200 plus autonomous vehicles, dozens of remote cranes, and a constant flow of cargo across a facility this large, while maintaining the reliability that major shipping alliances require, is a genuinely hard problem. The margin for error in a port where a single disrupted vessel can back up a week's worth of schedules is essentially zero. What to watch? TUIS Phase 1 is operational. Phases 2, 3, and 4 are in various stages of construction and planning. The full consolidation of Singapore's older terminals into TUIS is expected by the 2040s. The early signals are promising. Singapore's berth productivity is improving. The congestion that peaked in 2025 has eased as additional TUIS berths came online. Major shipping alliances have maintained Singapore as a primary hub despite the disruption, which suggests the network effect is holding, but the competition hasn't stopped either. Malaysia is building. Vietnam is positioning. Thailand's land bridge hasn't broken ground yet, but the political will is there. And China's port system is adding automation at a scale that makes TUIS look like a pilot program. The race isn't between ships anymore. It's between operating systems. Singapore looked at its position, a small island with everything to lose, and decided the only defensible answer was to build the most advanced port in the world and make itself irreplaceable. Whether that bet pays off will depend on decisions made in shipping boardrooms, government ministries, and trade negotiations far from Singapore's shores. The port is being built, the technology is running, the containers are moving. What changes now is whether the rest of the world lets Singapore keep moving them. Is port automation the future of global trade, or a threat to the workers who built the maritime industry? And which country do you think is best positioned to dominate global shipping by 2040? Let us know in the comments. If this kind of story is what you're here for, subscribe. We cover the infrastructure and power shifts reshaping the global economy, one project at a time.